over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Welcome back. As always, thank you all so much for joining. The University of Michigan is under federal scrutiny after two Chinese scientists linked to the school were separately charged with smuggling biological materials into the United States. On June 2nd, the U.S. Department of Justice charged Yanguing Zhan and Xinyang Lu, with both citizens of the People's Republic of China, with conspiracy, smuggling goods into the U.S., making false statements, and visa fraud. And if I mispronounce their names, I truly apologize. My Chinese is a little rusty. Are these researchers really agro-terrorists posing as scientists, a serious threat to U.S. security, or are they the scapegoats of an escalating U.S. Cold War witch hunt against China? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and a broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly take a look at some of today's headlines. Israel intends to take over Gaza, Netanyahu says ahead of security meeting. Prime Minister Netanyahu intends to expand military operations to occupy all of Gaza, including in areas where hostages are being held. That is not sitting well with the families of the remaining hostages. Time magazine reports Vicky Cohen, the mother of Israeli hostage Nimrod Cohen, has spoken out against reports that Netanyahu plans to fully occupy Gaza. Quote, "We're hearing talk about conquering Gaza. That will be the death sentence for our hostages," end quote. And she said this after stating, interestingly, the Israeli government is ruining all of their values. Trump celebrates new tariffs as negotiations continue with China. The administration says the tariffs could bring in $50 billion each month. What's not included in Trump's quips and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's claims is that companies often pass the cost of tariffs on to the consumer in the form of price increases. Additionally, as the Washington Post has reported, some economists worry that Trump's new trade policy could cause the economy to shrink and rupture certain alliances that domestic producers have relied upon to manufacture cheap goods. The Financial Times reports Donald Trump calls on Intel chief to resign, and that's the CEO of the company Intel. U.S. president alleges that semiconductor industry veteran Lip-Bu Tan is, quote, highly conflicted, end quote. Trump has called for the newly appointed chief executive of Intel, Lip-Bu Tan, to resign, alleging that the semiconductor industry veteran is highly conflicted. The CEO of Intel is, again, well, that's just a quote from Trump. Interesting that this conflict simply seems to be because of Mr. Tan's ties to China. And finally, Spain shuns U.S. F-35 jets as tensions grow in Washington. Madrid to purchase European military aircraft in sign of deepening rift with Trump over defense and foreign policy. Spain is opting to replace its aging fleet with European military aircraft rather than the U.S. F-35 fighter. We'll see if, and no pun intended, we'll see if Spain sticks to its guns. A quick point about yesterday. As we were wrapping up the show, Jonathan Soul gave us a $10 super sticker, and I missed that contribution. Jonathan, thank you very much for that. And he asked the question while we had Lawrence Wilkerson with us, why didn't Powell run for president? I know, Jonathan, having the colonel answer that question would have been the perfect opportunity. I missed it. I apologize. And just let me quickly give you my analysis of that. Powell decided not to run for president because he realized the realities of an African American, particularly in the Republican Party, making a move like that at that particular time in our history. If you recall, he said he did not want to subject his family to the level of scrutiny and the process that they would be subjected to if he ran. And right after he said that, the Washington Post published an article above the fold, Alma Powell suffers from depression. And then the next day after they ran that story, they ran another story. Alma Powell takes medication to deal with her depression. And I believe that those were two shots across Colin Powell's bow, letting him know, if you want to jump out here, Mr. Black Man, general or not, Secretary of State or not, and run for president, they got something for you. And I think he took the signs very clearly and decided to keep his powder dry and stay out of the race. So again, Jonathan Soul, thank you for yesterday's super sticker. And I apologize that I did not see it on time, and because I would have really liked to have gotten Colonel Wilkerson's answer to that question. On today's episode, the issue before us is the University of Michigan is under scrutiny after two Chinese scientists linked to the school were separately charged with smuggling biological materials into the United States. One of my questions is, how can you be charged with smuggling dangerous materials that are not on the list of dangerous materials? My guest is a teacher, activist, political analyst, also the host of the China Report, KJ Noh. As always, KJ, welcome back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
There are two issues I want to quickly cover before we get to the Chinese scientists. First, the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on Japan 80 years ago yesterday, August 6th. It was a uranium gun-type bomb that exploded with about 13 kilotons of force. At the time of the bombing, Hiroshima was home to 280 to 290,000 civilians, as well as 43,000 soldiers. It is reported that between 90,000 and 166,000 people are believed to have died from the bomb in the 4-month period following the explosion. Then 3 days after that, what this year will be this coming Saturday, the 80th commemoration of the United States dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A second bomb dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th. I'm sorry, I got my countries backwards. But 21 kiloton plutonium device known as the Fat Man, estimated 263,000 were in Nagasaki, including 240,000 Japanese residents. Seems to be very little interest in discussing this horrific anniversary, for lack of a better word. Your thoughts, KJ?
Well, I mean, it's an anniversary which is stained with shame and horror. So it's not surprising that, even august institutions like the Smithsonian, as well as the mainstream press, are trying to avoid it completely. What we do have to remember about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the Japanese were already in the process of surrendering. This was completely and totally gratuitous, simply a message that they wanted to send to the Soviet Union that we are nuclear armed, and that anything that we do to Japan, we can also do to you. So it was a message to the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Japanese were surrendering because the Soviet Union had started to cut through their troops in Manchuria like a butter through, like a hot knife through butter. They were essentially finished. They were just looking for a face-saving way to surrender gracefully. And the United States, because A, they wanted to test these new weapons, and B, because they wanted to message and threaten the Soviet Union, decided that they would wipe out hundreds of thousands of civilians for a political messaging. It's also unknown, certainly this piece is unknown, is that about 70,000 people of the civilians killed on the ground were Koreans, because the Koreans had been brought to Japan as forced labor, essentially slaves. Japan had colonized Korea, and Koreans were brought into Japan as slave labor for the military machine. And so when the atomic bombs went off both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were working in factories which were closest to the epicenter. When the bomb went off, the people who survived, who were Japanese, many of them escaped to the countryside to escape the radiation. The Koreans couldn't do that because they had no homes in the countryside. They were, forced labor. And then the third thing, which I think is, the most horrific, is that they were denied medical care because they were considered to be illegal aliens, without status, that were mooching on, Japanese resources. And so the moment Japan surrendered, all the Korean forced laborers were considered to have no status and essentially illegal laborers, and they were denied medical care, any medical care, for decades. So the highest death rates you actually see are in the Korean population that were in Japan at the time.
I have a question for you, and this came to my mind earlier today as I was working on something else. And this is not a rhetorical statement disguised as a question. Want to get your insight to this. My question is the United States, or was the United States, ever really an empire? And here's why I asked the question. The United States is only 249 years old. Many will say it became an empire after World War II. So that's 80 years, 1945. If you look at the Roman Empire was technically an empire for about 1,500 years. The Greek Empire was an empire for about, I want to say, 700, from 800 BC to 146 BC, something like that. The Ottoman Empire was an empire for about 600 years. So I was working on something else, and I was looking at the numbers, and I said, is the United States should it even be considered as such? KJ Noh.
I think there are different ways to look at it. Some people would say yes. Some historians would say yes and no. It's a complex question. Certainly, the U.S.
That's why I asked you. I ask smart people complex questions.
Well, certainly, the U.S. is an empire in the sense that it is a capitalist regime that is overextending itself to deal with its internal contradictions. On that level, there is no mistake. It is also a military empire. It is an empire of bases. It is a financial empire. And it is, without a doubt, in absolute terms, the most violent empire in the history of mankind. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you don't have to go to Martin Luther King. Just look at the numbers.
Right.
So yes, it is an empire, and it is also, it seems to be a rather short-lived empire if we compare it to the other historical evidence.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that answer. So now to the issue at hand. What's going on with the U.S. Department of Justice charging Yenguing Wan and Zhenyang Lu, both citizens of the People's Republic of China, with conspiracy, smuggling goods into the U.S., making false statements, and visa fraud? Explain, first of all, what have been the circumstances? Who are these people? Who are these scientists? And what are the circumstances around these charges?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing to understand is that I'll start with one person. Liu is the boyfriend of Yuqing Jian. Jian is a researcher. She's a postdoc researcher who studies a fungus called Fusarium graminearum. This is a fungus that causes wheat blight and damages crops. She's actually an important researcher in it. She's, produced 3 peer-reviewed articles that have over 200 citations, which is pretty impressive for such a, kind of a
robust, to say the least.
Absolutely. For such a specific field, to have 200 citations on your 3 articles, where she is the lead researcher in 2 of them, shows that she's a very, very smart cookie. And what she was doing was she was analyzing, how Fusarium graminearum regenerates itself, and then what are the agents that can be used against Fusarium graminearum to prevent it from causing damage to crops. So she's one of the people who's actually on the good side. She's trying to prevent damage. Apparently what happened was that her boyfriend, she talked to her boyfriend, asked him to bring a strain in from China so that she could do research on it in the United States. Why are they bringing a Chinese strain? Because these strains differ very, very slightly. And so in order to keep testing and make sure that your defenses are effective, you want to try different strains that are slightly different, but they're essentially the same fungus.
If I could throw in an analogy, it would be the flu virus that mutates every year. And so the United States looks at the viruses in Australia and other places where the flu hits before it hits here. They adjust their medications, so you keep getting as current of a flu vaccine as you can. Is that a fair analogy to draw?
Absolutely. Yes,
Okay.
It's a fair analogy. And if I may permit myself another analogy, the most important thing to understand about this fungus is it is not on any list of bioagents. So, she is not a bioterrorist or agro-terrorist, as the Department of Justice is framing this story as. It is about as common as athlete's foot in a locker room. So it's a little bit like it's like arresting Dr. Leon, for trekking athlete's foot into a gym, right? It's absurd. It's everywhere. It's like saying that, you brought E. coli into Chuck E. Cheese. Well, no, sorry. There's E. coli everywhere in Chuck E. Cheese, right? So the allegations are absurd on the face of it, because she was trying to prevent damage from this fungus. And also the fungus is prevalent. It's everywhere. It's, omnipresent in the United States. But they framed it as that she was, trying to smuggle in dangerous bio agents, agro-terror agents that could affect the national security of the United States. And they, threw the book at her. So they charged her with smuggling, with conspiring, with making false statements and visa violations. And, she could face 20 years in prison for what is essentially a small process error. If you've ever gotten onto a plane, Wilmer, and you get those like peanuts for your air snack.
Mhm.
And if you take those peanuts and you put them in your pocket, you don't eat them right away, you put them in your pocket and you go through customs, you have broken the law, because peanuts are an agricultural product, they're food, and you need to declare that when you go through customs. So in some sense, this is a process error of similar scope and scale. They were probably trying to do a little workaround because they didn't want to spend weeks and months waiting, doing the paperwork, waiting for authorization to, move, this through customs. And so they, cut corners. They were caught, and then they threw the book at Jan and her boyfriend. Now, her boyfriend was simply refused entry. If this was serious, they would have kept him and they would have thrown federal charges at him as well. But he was simply refused entry. And then Jan was arrested and charged with, these 4 overblown charges. Now, the University of Michigan, which should be protecting its researchers, instead of, understanding that this was a minor process error, which all of their researchers are probably doing all the time, they essentially sat on their hands and said, we are going to comply with everything. We're going to make sure we're compliant. We're going to do trainings. And essentially, they threw her under the bus. I mean, they have resources. They could defend her. They could make public statements about the integrity of the research, the fact that Fusarium graminearum is prevalent in the United States, that the charges that are being made are absurd, and that it is important for scientific research that scientists be allowed to do critical research without being hounded in a witch hunt. But apparently, the University of Michigan has gone prostrate on this issue, and they're letting their researchers dangle in the wind. The other researcher is another Chinese. Her name is Cheng Xuan Han, and she apparently is guilty of smuggling in plasmids and roundworms. Plasmids and roundworms. You find these everywhere. You dig up your garden, you will find no end of plasmids and roundworms. So the kind of absurdity, yes. Did they cut corners? Yes, they cut corners the way that people sometimes speed when they're driving on the freeway, the way that people put their peanut snack into their pocket and cross customs. Yes, they did these things, and they probably shouldn't have done them. At least that's the accusation. But to throw the book at them and to charge them with 20 years, these are the only children of their parents by the time, if the charges stick and they're charged to the max, they will be white-haired, and their grandparents, if not their parents, will be dead by the time they get out. So this extraordinary punitive approach signals 2 things. One is it's the classical witch hunt, essentially red peril and yellow scare. They say that, John, is a member of the CPC. Well, no doo-doo, Sherlock, almost all good students are invited to join the party. It's like joining Phi Beta Kappa. If you're a good student, you're invited. It's kind of a little, performative, process, and they do it because they just want, to gather dues from these people. So it's not a big deal, but they're making it sound like she's some kind of, nefarious communist agent. And then they also point out that she received funding from the Chinese government. Well, in China, it's a public education system. Anybody who studies or does research is receiving funding from the Chinese government. So they're trying to construct a very, very flimsy case, but one that is incredibly dangerous and damaging to these very earnest and accomplished young researchers. And not only will it destroy, U.S.-China relations and cooperation in science. Science is, it's an intellectual commons. It grows by scholars sharing with each other.
Right.
But also, it is an escalation in the hybrid information war against China. Essentially, what the DOJ is trying to say is the Chinese are deceitful, dishonest, dirty, and dangerous, and they are threatening our security. And it's part of the escalation to war against China by targeting Chinese and painting them as dangerous, fifth column agents that threaten our security. And it's to manufacture more consent for war. So this is what is so disturbing and sickening about this case. And, the utter, lack of moral backing on the part of the University of Michigan is also very, very disappointing. If you look through their website, you'll see a large number of their scientists are actually Chinese. So they've sent a message to all their Chinese scholars, you are not welcome here.
I'm going to add, I understand everything you just said, but I'm still going to ask why these scientists? Because groundworms, oh my goodness, aphids or whatever the hell. I mean, oh my God, groundworms, and bringing in a fungus that's already here. If they were nuclear scientists and alleging that they brought in some Chinese isotope as a way of building the next neutron bomb, okay, then not that arresting them would still make sense, but you could construct a better story around nuclear scientists than folks that are bringing roundworms into the United States and a fungus that is already here. So I'm trying to understand basically why pick on them.
I think this is just the thin edge of the wedge. It's just the start. Remember, previously during the Trump administration, there was this thing called the China Initiative, and they went after all Chinese researchers. There were thousands of Chinese researchers were investigated. According to the FBI, they were opening a new investigation against Chinese researchers every 8 to 10 hours. After thousands of investigations and hundreds of lives ruined, they essentially came up with almost nothing. They came up with a few minor process errors, failure to disclose, etc. And they prosecuted those cases to the max. And they still lost most of those cases, which is extraordinary, because when the federal government prosecutes people, including plea bargains, they usually win somewhere between 99.92 to 99.97% of its cases. But they lost, I think, 75% of the cases that they were prosecuting in the China Initiative. And so the Biden administration continued it, but they rebranded it and just made it a little bit more diffuse, but they were doing it. They were still continuing it. And now the Trump administration, I believe, has brought it back in full force. And essentially, as I said, why are they doing this? It is about manufacturing consent for war. It's about demonizing the other, demonizing Chinese scientists. Usually they say that the Chinese are stealing science from the US, but of course they're not, because they're more advanced in many, many fields.
Right.
And then I think it also plays to the anti-immigrant sentiment of, the MAGA and, just people in general. I mean, the country is going to shit, and nobody knows who to blame, but yes, let's blame the Chinese, Chinese researchers. Let's blame these, young Chinese women who are trying to help the United States. They must be the targets of this. So that's one piece. The second piece, and this is more speculative on my part, Dr. Leon, is that this is clearly an academic witch hunt.
Mm-hmm.
It has echoes of the early 1950s McCarthyite witch hunts against Chinese. But that also has earlier echoes in the witch hunts against quote unquote witches in Western Europe during the 12th century to the 16th century. And one of the key starting points, one of the key triggers for a witch hunt in for example, in Germany or in Western Europe was crop failure. If your crops fail,
Mm-hmm.
start looking for a witch. And it's almost always a poor, working class woman, a female peasant, and they charge her and they torture her with witchcraft. She claims that, she, used sorcery to damage the crops. And then she's forced to accuse other people. And then pretty soon you have 900, 1,000 people that you burn at the stake, literally, as happened at, Bamberg or, other places in Germany. So I think that the using of potential agricultural damage is a way of really rekindling some very ancient prejudices and fears that are prevalent, in the superstitious mindset. And so I think that's why they went after these scientists. But I believe that this is just the start. I think that more prosecutions will come down the line, and unless there's strong stand made against this.
You just mentioned that what we're witnessing right now is a continuation of a policy that was initiated under the Biden administration. And I think it's very important here for people to understand that, once again, as I say all the time, a lot of folks tend to see Donald Trump as the cause, but Donald Trump is the culmination. He is not the cause. And there are a number of things that he is implementing which were initiated under the Biden administration or previous administrations to his. This is not Trump policy. This is American policy. KJ.
Absolutely. It's American policy. There's continuity between administration. It was done by Trump, then continued by Biden, and then continued by Trump again. So there's continuity. It's not consolidation or chaos. There's very, very clear continuity in these anti-China policies, in the escalation to war, which we can refer to as the pivot to peace, which was rebranded as the Indo-Pacific strategy. This has been ongoing for at least 15 years, and it simply accelerates faster and faster, becomes more and more intense. But you're absolutely right. Trump is being used as a scapegoat, as a way of disowning the horrific effects and the horrific, optics of what is actually going on. This way they get to say that, it's Donald Trump, it's this individual, he's the moral scapegoat. And it's their way of avoiding, certainly the liberal class, the people with TDS, it's their way of avoiding responsibility for their complicity in a systemic failure and a systemic, breakdown of the system.
As the United States currently is engaged in negotiations with China, or at least it alleges that it is engaged in negotiations with China, as I'm trying to figure out a rationale for such a boneheaded move, could this be the United States looking for negotiating leverage? Is is the plight, or are the plights of these scientists something that could make their way up to and into the negotiation process that the United States is engaged in with China?
It's possible, and certainly we saw similar types of actions with, for example, Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. Huawei, remember, was building out the 5G networks of the global south, essentially creating a digital Silk Road and building out, the global internet infrastructure of the global south. The US did not want that because they want to have a monopoly over this infrastructure because they want to be able to surveil it. And the Huawei routers were impermeable to US surveillance. It was, destroying the US electronic panopticon. And so instead of, offering better deals, they simply kidnapped Meng Wanzhou and used her as a bargaining chip. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. But I think that these individuals, they're graduate, postdoc researchers. So they could be used as bargaining chips, but I don't actually think that they're that important or, important enough to put significant pressure, unless they have, hundreds or thousands of being held in custody. And that's not out of the question either. But yes, I think as a pattern, it's part of the pattern. But if they are part of the leveraging, there will be a small part of it, and they will, there will be more chips that will be put on the board first.
And to your Huawei 5G story, I think it's important for people to really to remember that China approached the United States and asked, and while China was developing 5G, the Chinese government approached the United States and wanted to do this cooperatively. They wanted to have a cooperative development of the technology, and the United States refused, arrogantly thinking that they could develop this on their own, only to find out that they were not able to. And that's really when the United States turned its ire towards China relative to 5G. That's my understanding of the story.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The Chinese offered to develop it with the United States. In fact, there were a lot of Huawei networks that were built in the United States. If you go to the Midwest, where it's not very cost effective for US companies, it's Huawei that went in and built out all these repeater stations. And
wait a minute, Huawei routers were all through the Department of Defense.
Absolutely.
Huawei routers were the primary router that was used all throughout the United States government networks.
Yes.
And go ahead.
They were cheap, they were robust, they were brilliantly engineered, and they were very, very affordable in terms of installation and maintenance and reliability. So there was every reason to keep them. And the US wanted to work, the Huawei wanted to work with the United States to develop even further, but the US said no. And the reason why they said no is, as I pointed out, they want this electronic panopticon. They want to be able to control the world. And one of the key ways that they assert this full spectrum dominance is by controlling the electromagnetic domain. They consider that to be a domain of contestation or of war, and they want monopoly control over it. It's as if, there's a thing called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which says that the United States will be the unipolar hegemon or the boss of the world. And you can understand that the US also has a kind of digital Wolfowitz Doctrine, in that they understand that they have to be the unipolar monopoly hegemon of the digital sphere, because this is how they maintain power over the planet. Of course, they have the bases. Of course, they have, technology. But ultimately, the thing that allows them to control the world is by controlling the digital sphere. This allows them to surveil. This allows them to propagandize. This allows them to censor everything you see here and encounter in the electronic sphere is in some way, manner, or form restricted or controlled by the US. So they want to maintain this digital Wolfowitz doctrine, and Huawei was cutting into that. And it was actually creating the grounds for a kind of digital sovereignty for these global South countries. And that is a non-starter. And so the US came down hard against Huawei.
And just to wrap up this whole thing about Huawei, it's important we've heard about IT, the Internet of Things. And a couple of years ago, there was all this promotion in the United States about the Internet of Things. Your car was going to talk to your refrigerator. And if you're on your way home and your kid came home from school and drank up all the milk, your refrigerator would send a message to your car or send a message to your phone, stop at the store and well, why, folks, why has that technology in the United States not developed to the degree that it was advertised? A big part of it is because the United States engineers, they don't have the horsepower to develop it. And they turned their backs on the countries that do, primarily the country that does, and that's China. And the other point is, and we're going to get to this iPhone conversation in a minute, but we in the West are led to believe that the iPhone is the preeminent phone and the dominant phone throughout the world. It is not. Actually, it's not even in the top 5. Huawei phones dominate the world cellular phone market. And when you look at the latest release of the Huawei phone, their phone is not only cellular, it's satellite. It has satellite technology. The United States is, in fact, you turn on your phone here in the West and it says 5G. Folks, that's not really 5G. It's just faster 4. We don't even have 5G in the United States. KJ.
Yeah, and in China, they're already building out, robust 6G network, and probably going on to 7. Yes, 6 going on 7. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Huawei makes some of the best phones in the world. Not only are they satellite phones, the cameras are extraordinary. And they also are building everything from soup to nuts by themselves now. The US put these incredible chokeholds on Huawei and on Chinese tech in general. They strangled the chips that went into the phones. They strangled the platform, the Android platform. So Huawei simply built its own chips and its own platform. They even prevented Huawei from using US enterprise software, which is, how the corporation communicates with itself.
Right.
So Huawei simply, made its own enterprise software. And so they are a continuing powerhouse. I believe they spend approximately $20 billion a year on research, and they're a research powerhouse. 170,000 employees, a large number who are researchers, and they are also, and this is very important to understand, they are a worker-owned company. Yes. This is not, it's not Microsoft where everything goes to, Bill Gates or whoever is in power. It's a worker-owned company, and they have just broken the mold in terms of what you can do in terms of high tech, in terms of self-sufficiency, in terms of cutting edge research, and in terms of a worker-owned, company. So they are, they, like many things that China is doing, is breaking the mold in many ways. And the US sees this as, a threat. It's a threat to its ideology, to its sense of superiority, to its sense of supremacy, and also to its, to the legitimacy of its system. So this is why the US so deeply committed to not just destroying Huawei, but destroying the Chinese system in general. I mean, China is a model of a country that shows that you can rise and you can develop and you can make a good country for all your people without engaging in slavery, colonization, aggressive wars, and mass exploitation. And that is something that the ruling imperial elite in the United States cannot tolerate. That's why they need to destroy the example of China. And this is why we constantly see these escalations to war.
Carol Asbaram, thank you for that super sticker and her comment. Speaking of war against China, she's reading an excellent book by Matthias Chang, Brainwashed for War, Programmed to Kill. More people should read the book. And Kevin Baptiste says he just picked it up the day before. So I'm glad to see we've got some literature being sent through these chats, and that some of you all are reading similar works. And Carol says, hit the like button and donate to this excellent program, people. Carol, thank you very much for that. And folks, if Carol tells you to do it, then you always got to be right with Carol. So you want to be sure you get that done. Kevin Baptiste, thank you for that $5 super sticker. And Kevin is a member of the Connecting the Dots Club, as is Carol. China's sovereignty has scared the crap out of the U.S., prompting this insane agenda against them. And Kevin, you're absolutely right. And it's not only China's sovereignty, it's anybody's sovereignty that the U.S. finds to be a challenge as the U.S. decides to challenge it. Your thoughts, KJ?
You're absolutely right. The U.S. doesn't tolerate sovereign countries around the world. They want everybody, every country, to be a sharecropper on the U.S. plantation. And anybody who tries to escape from that is going to be shot. That's essentially their worldview. And of course, simply because China is so big and large and it has asserted its sovereignty, and it's showing a model for other countries, than the U.S. This is why the U.S. is looking to escalate to war. Now, I think what's also important to note is that China's response to the United States is not to be baited into a war, but it's a series of asymmetrical moves. You know, if you like, on chess, they're knight's moves. They're not readily visible. But I think one of the most notable things that China is doing right now, and you know, perhaps it's they could have done it sooner, but they're restricting the export of rare earth elements to U.S. weapons manufacturers. And this has the U.S. military-industrial complex in a tizzy. They are panicked because essentially they are not able to make the weapons of destruction and mass destruction that they have been, using all over the planet. You know, Trump did this tariff war, and that gave China the opening to implement this gambit, and they're not backing down. So, just to go over, rare earth elements are, rare elements, 17 lanthanides and a few others that are used in all US weapon systems, in particular in heat resistance magnets, samarium cobalt magnets. And we have to understand, the modern world is driven by electronics. Electronics is the manipulation of electromagnetic force in different ways. And note, we have the word magnet in electromagnetic. Without magnets, you have nothing. You have no advanced electronic technology. You need them in guidance systems, in stabilization systems, in avionics, in radar, in sensor and detection platforms, in propulsion systems. Even stealth jet coatings need rare earth element magnets. And then, not to mention your computer, your hard drive is essentially a magnet, which with a neodyne, with a rare earth element reading head. And so, I have a colleague called Ja. He says the U.S. can print money, but it can't print missiles. And those missiles and radars all need magnets. And so, I say to that, the US can invent any new technology it wants, but it cannot invent new rare earth elements. That's a closed set. And so this is a powerful move that China is doing right now to essentially kneecap the US war machine. China has a monopoly on the processing of rare earth elements, probably 90 to 95%. And all the US weapons manufacturers are now going into a shortage and are having, panic attacks. Deng Xiaoping, saw this back in the 1990s, and he strategically instructed the development of rare earth elements, which shows you how far ahead they're thinking. And the US has only just recently realized this, and it is panicking and very, very upset about this. But I say that it's a good development.
It's hard to understand with what you've just articulated, and understanding that was a card that China played very quickly in terms of their rare earth elements in these negotiations. And then as soon as China made that play, that forced the United States to change its entire negotiating position.
Yes.
And so one just has to sit back and wonder, what kind of idiots is the United States sending into these conversations, into these so-called it takes me back to one of my favorite references, which is the Chinese delegation in Anchorage during the Biden administration, when they just got up and said, we're not going to sit here and listen to you lecture us. You don't realize who you're talking to. And so the Chinese delegation got up and walked out. And I say to folks, it's not only that China got up and walked out. You have to understand what that symbolized by China doing it, because that's not a move that China will tend, because they understand the power of diplomacy. So all of that just to scratch my head and say, what in the world? Who are we sending into these what children are we sending in to these conversations? Because we just don't get it. Your final point, KJ.
Well, that was, the spoilt Anthony Blinken who set that entire thing up. And he, brought the Chinese in all the way to Anchorage. He didn't give them food, which, in Chinese culture is inexcusable insult. Apparently, the Chinese delegation were reduced to eating instant ramen noodles. So anyway, that it was set up to be an insult, and he was going to lecture them and tell them about the superiority of the United States and their, system. And the Chinese wouldn't take it. They told them, keep the cameras here and let us give you, a piece of our mind. And they did. And after that, Blinken, I believe, was never the same again. But it speaks to the arrogance, the hubris, this, white supremacy that permeates the U.S. State Department. I'm just thinking of that guy who was harassing the halal vendor, Stuart Seldowitz. I mean, he was harassing the halal vendor in New York and saying, 4,000 dead Palestinian children is not enough. We need to kill more. I mean, this is a guy, he's insane. He is, he's like an understudy for Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. But these are the people who are holding the key positions. This mindset is prevalent in the State Department. And these are people holding important portfolios in the State Department. Stuart Seldowitz was actually responsible for Palestine and Israel. He was mediating, the two-state solution, the so-called two-state solution. He was mediating that. And this is a man who thinks that it is perfectly okay to massacre and genocide children. These are the people who are leading the State Department. Kurt Campbell, similar thing. Kurt Campbell was asked about Korea, and and he said, "We will unleash a magnificent symphony of death there." A magnificent symphony of death. How does a public official put those words together and declare them in public? It's astounding. But this is, I believe, this is how the ruling imperial elite thinks. And Trump has exposed that in very clear and obvious ways. But whether they say it public or not, this is very clear that this is how they work. This is how they think. It's based on white supremacy. It's based on this notion of full spectrum dominance and unipolar hegemony. And they just cannot tolerate that they would ever be challenged or confronted on their hypocrisy and violence in any fashion. And so this is why, again, they're looking for war. They're driving into the pain, trying to draw a foul, trying to use that as an excuse to start a war. You see that there's a massive, massive push in information warfare. The Taiwan DPP Quislings have just released a television series, which is essentially a massive toxic piece of propaganda. And it signals that all the stops have been pulled out in threat mongering to manufacture consent for war against China in Taiwan Island. And it also claims that there is a China-friendly fifth column. And all of this is to induct the entire society into preparation for, in particular, urban warfare. This is so slick. I mean, these are billions of dollars that are going into PR firms that are working in a very coordinated fashion. And you can also see, again, that there's a recent Hudson report, which, I think it's worth people checking out, but it's about China after communism, what to do with a dismembered and disemboweled China. And they're already planting, the propaganda in people's minds that China is already, a done deal. The war is a done deal. We have to think about what to do with a dismembered China after we, finish, bombing it. So,
and as we get out, that's a similar mindset to the balkanization of Russia.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, they're full of scenarios like this, but essentially they're trying to get people to accept that already this is a done deal. Both China and Russia and Iran are already, dismembered or neutered, and that the United States is back on top, and we will have our way with the world as we believe is our God-given right. These are the horrifying and frightening thoughts that are trending through the media sphere, and especially at the elite levels right now.
KJ Noh, thank you so much, my brother, for joining the program today. Greatly appreciate it. And folks, check out KJ, phenomenal show, the China Report, a YouTube program. Check it out. Always on point. Appreciate it, KJ.
Thank you so much. It's on the Breakthrough News Network.
Thank you. The Breakthrough News Network. Thank you. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episode tomorrow. Margaret Kimberly is going to join us tomorrow from Black Agenda Report. Margaret Kimberly will join us, so be sure you're on board for that. Follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. You can follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow with Margaret Kimberly. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.